every time I walk into the gym, it's always like insanely packed with Asian men. Or a lot of the Asian men I see, they always like really work out a lot. And that's because, yeah, being an Asian man, especially in Western society, like it's a super emasculating experience. Uh, I don't know, like, I'm sure a lot of people have heard it before, but a lot of Asian men really aren't seen as, men in a hegemonic sense, a traditionally masculine sense.
And welcome back to the Colour Reimagined Podcast, presented to you by people of color clothing. Of course, I'm your host, Darius, and I sit down with special guest Geoffrey, where we talk about growing up biracial, imposter syndrome, and Asian male masculinity. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Just to kind of get the conversation kicked off and started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Geoffrey Engel. So I'm a second year at Oregon State University right now. I'm studying merchandising management. Yeah, go Bees. With a minor in sociology. So it's a pretty fun duo. I'm really interested in like the intersection between fashion and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, kind of focusing on how those big companies and corporations can make more positive social impact. Getting a little more personal. So I'm 19. My mom's adopted from Korea when she was an infant, adopted into a white family. My dad's white. It's a pretty, common interracial marriage kind of trope. But yeah, so I was raised in that environment. I'm from Portland. Anyone who's been to Portland or knows Portland, at least West Portland, knows what's that like. Yeah.
All right, for sure. And I know we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your mother and that dynamic in regards to her being adopted as an infant, and that kind of leading up to, your experience. So can you kind of let the audience in on your mother and her background?
Definitely. Yeah. So she was adopted from South Korea when she was an infant. The family she was adopted into, entirely white, and historically wealthy white family too. Everybody was doctors, a pretty nuclear family thing in Portland. So growing up, she was pretty isolated from her, her ethnic heritage, I guess you can call it. I think she's been to Korea once, but obviously being in the family she was a part of, she was really culturally isolated from it. Growing up, yeah, she had a pretty normal childhood, and then married my dad, who's a white man. Then they had me and my sister.
All right, for sure. And then just kind of, I know this is kind of speaking for your mother, but do you feel like any point in her life, even maybe leading up to her trip to Korea, that she took it upon herself to kind of navigate her Korean culture? Or was it just something that she, I guess, embraced the white culture and just kind of stayed in that pocket? Or was it that curiosity ever emerging for her and even for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously I'm speaking for her. I can't be entirely accurate. But yeah, I would say from what I've seen, she really didn't do a lot of that navigating Korean culture when she was younger. But I would say, around post 2020, it's a really common experience for a lot of people of color who are, culturally isolated. She did start kind of leaning into her Korean culture a little bit more and kind of exploring what's there, mostly BTS and whatnot, but it's still something to do. It was around the time when I started navigating my culture. It was about 2-3 years ago when I started getting interested in, kind of what Korea and generally East Asia had to offer culturally, kind of connecting there. So we kind of started doing that a little bit together. But growing up, yeah, she really did just lean into the, as much as a person of color can, into the white environment.
So Geoffrey, kind of, now that we learn a little bit about your mother, can you kind of speak to your experience growing up as a first gen, Asian American with a strong white social tie, and what that experience was like for you, and what are some of the experience that you kind of missed because of that?
Yeah, it was really interesting in terms of how I saw myself, in terms of racialization, right? Growing up, when I heard stories about, first gen Asian Americans or children of immigrants, a lot of the experiences I didn't really relate to at all. Like, people talk about language barriers or having to translate for their parents at parent-teacher conferences. I never had that because, my mom doesn't speak Korean. Or experiences where, I brought this food and like everybody was teasing for that, and I felt alienated. I had like Lunchables and like PB&J growing up because, white family. So it really led me to not really see myself as Asian, right? Because there was kind of a single story narrative going around in, generally America of this is what it means to be a first-gen individual. And I didn't reflect that. So I really struggled to to see myself as Asian. And as far as how that really impacted me, it was really destructive as a kid. I remember, a lot of Asian kids growing up, they experienced a lot of racism in terms of not super violent, nothing. Well, I'm not going to say nothing horrible, but a lot of comments made here and there. And I started at a certain point not enjoying it, but I almost felt like a sense of relief to know that people saw me as Asian, right? I felt so alienated from this identity that in experiencing that explicit racism, it kind of felt validating. I was like, oh, I am Asian.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And it kind of built this association that I definitely want to talk about a little bit more later on, but this association that to be Asian or to be a person of color was like synonymous with the experience of explicit racism. So it's pretty tough.
Oh,
shit. It was interesting.
So can you kind of explain or kind of help visualize your awakening? Like, when did you have your awakening and take on that Asian identity and take on that desire to want to advocate for marginalized communities?
Definitely. I would say, so like I said, I'm 19. I'm a sophomore. So probably around sophomore year of high school is when I started getting connected to, different cultures. I've mentioned it before, but it was K-pop pretty heavily, kind of looking at BTS. And it was really powerful in the sense where it was the first time I'd seen, Asian people and especially Asian men be praised in any sort of media for like anything. And, I don't always want to like validate myself and my identity through other people's opinions, but it made me feel proud to be Asian for once. And I think having that pride maybe address this idea that, I am Asian. But moving forward, it was the summer of 2020 when I really started, starting my process of education, kind of looking at what my past experiences have been in relation to racism. And what I really figured out that helped me drive it in is I kind of took a second and looked at, I haven't considered myself to be a person of color. Why is that? So I kind of broke down what did I see as a person of color. So this is going to be a bit of a ramble, so I apologize for that. But
no. This is your platform, man. Talk.
Thank you. Yeah. So at Lincoln, I went to Lincoln High School in Portland. There was this club called Brothers of Color, right, which was generally supposed to support the identities of men of color. But when I looked at the demographic, it was not entirely, but it was, I would say 80% Black or Indigenous men of color. There weren't a lot of Asian people there, and that's totally fine. But when I looked at that, and I looked at that idea of, this is what a man of color is, I didn't really see my identity reflected. And that kind of worked in combination with the way we talked about racism in school, because it was usually during MLK week, but the only time we ever really talked about or MLK Day or Black History Month, the only time we really talked about race was in the context of racialized violence, generally against Black people. So it kind of built this association. The only time we talked about race was when explicit racism occurred. And so it built my understanding that to be a person of color was to experience explicit racism or any sort of racism. But obviously I didn't have the education to understand the racism that I'd experienced. So I only saw racism as explicit, and I only saw the way to be a person of color as experiencing racism. So which it's partly true for sure. It's being, on the oppressed end. But when I kind of broke that down and understood, okay, I've kind of seen the ways these systems of power have impacted me, and I've kind of expanded my idea of this single story for, being a person of color. Each individual is going to have their intersections and their own nuances for what they've experienced. And it kind of helped me understand my own place in that system.
Kind of taking some time to unpack your story a little bit. Can you kind of speak to this model minority myth and the whitewashing of Asian American identity?
Definitely. I kind of talked about how it was really hard for me to feel Asian or identify as Asian because I didn't fit these tropes. I would say in America, or in general Western society, there are a lot of stereotypes that go around of what it means to be Asian. And I even think to a certain extent it's perpetuated a lot by people who are Asian, specifically Asian American, in the sense where Asian people are really good at math or love bubble tea. I really love bubble tea, but it's still a stereotype. Or Asian people, they all know about these foods, or they all kind of do this or this or that. And I think there's a two-sided duality to that, right? Because on one hand, if you associate with that, and can be really supportive, right? You find these people with these shared experiences and you can kind of bring yourself closer together. But on the other hand, and I think this is what we'll see a lot as, our racial demographics starts to become a lot more, percentage based. It's not going to be so like 50, 100% this or that. Yeah. A lot of people don't really associate with those experiences, or you have people who have no connection to like those cultures. And so I think for me, at least, it put a lot of pressure to start doing some of those things. I think that for a lot of Asian people, and I'm speaking, on behalf, I might be wrong. I want to preface that, but for me, when I looked at these stereotypes that were talked about so often, it became a way for me to try to embrace those a little bit, to feel more Asian in my own regard, right? Like, okay, like this is what it means to be Asian. Like I got to do this. Like this is what it means to be Asian. Like I should do this. All the Asian people around me that I saw, they all had the same idea, right? Like, oh yeah, like bubble tea this, bubble tea that. And so it really put a lot of pressure on me to try to kind of mold myself to fit this identity, instead of looking at what these different cultures are and finding how they fit into my own role. Like I tried to force myself to fit the idea that they had of being Asian instead of navigating my own idea of what it meant to be.
That's really interesting. Like your background being a segue of you trying to, I guess, seek that Asian identity within yourself and really establish yourself in that. So it's really interesting to hear your story. It's very unique in the sense that, you embrace these things, while there's people out there just trying to like, hey, no. You're like, okay, I'm embracing this because this is what society says it's, fits the Asian culture, identity, etc. And, we've kind of heard, a little bit about your mother's experience and her family dynamic leading up to your experience, but I also understand just from like listening to you talk, you kind of hinted at having a sister. Can you kind of speak to her experience and maybe the cultural conundrum or the dynamic and how she's been able to kind of navigate her identity?
Yeah. So it's been super interesting. It's definitely a different experience than mine, but not one that's unheard of. And obviously, we're different genders, so that plays a role. But her name's Madeline, but she's definitely put less of an effort into navigating, her cultural heritage. That's not better. That's not worse, right? It just is what it is. And this is an experience I've seen with a lot of my friends. She's kind of part of that group of people who their identity as a person of color hasn't brought explicitly or anything they're conscious of a richness or benefit to them, right? Because when you look at the reasons we say, like, be proud of your background, like, be proud of your heritage, like, be proud of being Asian, it usually all traces back to, like, look at this culture you're from, look at this community you're part of. When you have these people who grew up basically white culturally, in a culturally white environment, and they don't have any connection to their cultural heritage, they don't have any of that, right? So the only association that they really have with being a person of color is oppression, right? Like not being found attractive by their peers who maybe they do find attractive. Like, Madeline, she likes white boys. But obviously white boys aren't really going to find her as attractive, at least beyond a fetishizing way, because she's not white. Or same with, some of the guys I'm friends with who are like Filipino, who are entirely separate from that. And so it kind of builds this idea of wishing you were white. Like I hear it all the time. Like sometimes I just wish I were white. And especially with the intersection of being Asian, like you said, there's really not a lot of Asian people being praised in media, or at least not in a meaningful way for women beyond sexualization. Yeah, so, sure. Yeah, it really just builds this idea that like, wow, like there's really nothing good about being Asian, in my opinion, right now. Like, I'm not seeing Black beauty praised. I'm not seeing, XYZ. I'm not seeing myself in a position of athletics, which, obviously is not great exploitation of Black bodies, but it's still, something that you see praised from, or it's something that you see role models. So I think for Madeline and for a lot of people, you don't have role models and you don't have this cultural connection and you don't have these benefits. So, what's the benefit? Like, I just wish I were white here.
Sheesh. Yeah, and I think it kind of takes back to like that whitewashing within society. Because I know, like, even speaking to previous guests, like, and them talking about Asian culture, Indian Asian culture, getting the double eyelid surgery, using the soap to lighten your skin, like it all kind of perpetuates itself into whitewashing, right? This idea that white is right.
Definitely.
And it's just, I don't know. I think it's really interesting because I don't know. I think we are so beautiful as people of color.
For sure.
Aside from just like, all the oppression talking on that other stuff, but just historically, like our history, we have such a hidden history especially here in America, kind of, you talk
Yeah.
like, you only learn about, the active, the violence that kind of happened in the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and February being like the year or the month of, talking about, marginalized communities. But I think, we have a history, and we come from brilliant people, beautiful cultures, and that's something that's kind of lost in the transition, especially here in America, where we try to whitewash everything and ban critical race theory and those type of tropes. So I think that it's your sister just sounds like she's a byproduct of like the system doing exactly what it's supposed to do in regards to whitewashing and hoping and wishing that you were something that you are obviously not.
Yeah, entirely. I have, definitely two things. Really quick, do you know about the origin of the the double eyelid surgery?
I do not know. No.
Yeah, so it's from Korea. So during the Korean War, there was this American soldier or American doctor who went to Korea who was supposed to treat burn victims, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, what he did is he developed this procedure, this double eyelid surgery, to make Korean and Asian women look more white, so they'd be more desirable to American GIs.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was literally made to make Asian women look more white so that white people would like them more.
And I'm assuming this was like an experimental thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was definitely practiced on Asian prostitutes, Korean prostitutes.
Oh, wow.
But so it was pretty fucked. I mean, I shouldn't say that so lightly. It was very fucked. But yeah, when you trace the origins again, like it's working as intended.
And kind of thinking over like the Asian male representation and experience and some of the negative stereotypes associated with Asian American men. Can you speak to that topic and kind of like the root of kind of where some of that rhetoric comes from and some of those negative stereotypes?
Definitely. Yeah. I say at the time, especially at OSC, which is surprising because it's only, 7% Asian or whatever. Mm-hmm. But, every time I walk into the gym, it's always like insanely packed with Asian men. Or a lot of the Asian men I see, they always like really work out a lot. And that's because, being an Asian man, especially in Western society, like it's a super emasculating experience. I don't know, like, I'm sure a lot of people have heard it before, but a lot of Asian men really aren't seen as, men in a hegemonic sense, a traditionally masculine sense, usually because of either the relationship they have with women or just their physical prowess. So yeah, kind of tracing that back. This isn't obviously the only reason why, but I did a little bit of research about U.S. immigration practices for people from Asia, specifically Asian men, Chinese men. And when we kind of look back at it, it all really starts with citizenship and everything that branches out from that. So we'll start with the gold rush. You had all these Chinese men coming in, and U.S. capitalists are basically thrilled, right? You have all these people doing all this cheap labor. They're just really looking for work, and it's a really exploitable market. Mm-hmm. So it's really similar to what we see now, actually, with people coming from South America or Latinx populations. A lot of white workers got really threatened by that. They're really worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about what this is going to mean for them. Right? It sounds really familiar.
Yeah, for sure.
It happens anyways because you have these, this bourgeoisie who wants to exploit this Asian labor because it's so inexpensive. And so what really happens is, these white middle lower class Americans, they have to do something about it. So the first thing they really started doing is kind of building this notion of, Asian men, like, now they're weak. They can't do this. And it's really funny because, Asian people in the past were characterized as these strong, hard workers, but now it's so emasculated. So, you start building that idea, these people can't do these jobs, these people can't do this work. But as time passes and, obviously the white male gets what they want, immigration basically stops, right? They're like, okay, like Chinese men, you can't be citizens, like you can't really come into this country. And most importantly, they've set this law that said anybody who marries someone not eligible for citizenship, they lose their citizenship, right?
Oh, wow.
If they're a non-white. Yeah, so a non-white individual, they'll lose their citizenship. I think it was like early 20s when that happened, actually. Wow. So right, it starts building this idea of Asian men can't connect to this nuclear family idea, this idea of men possessing women. So this starts building off, right? We look at Asian women dating American men or white men a lot. In 1946, there was something called the Chinese War Bride Act, which said that, so first, to preface, Asian women were barely allowed in the country at all.
Mhm.
Throughout the 1800s or the 1900s, the population of Chinese women for total Chinese in America never exceeded 7.2% of the Chinese population. So very few Asian women, because they weren't allowed in, because Americans thought that Asian women were going to turn to prostitution immediately, and America was going to get filled with prostitutes. But there was one exception, which is the Chinese War Bride Act of 1946, which said American military men can bring in Asian wives to the country. So the only Asian women entering the country really are with, military members. And other than that, only 105 Chinese people are able to enter the country. So this starts building this idea that Asian men are kind of impotent and, asexual and fully separate from this idea of possession of women. And obviously with, traditional toxic masculinity, that's pretty important. So you have this going on. And then at the same time, obviously, since white workers don't want to lose their jobs, Asian men are getting pushed into fields that men don't want to do, which is usually laundry. I think at one point, 1 in 12 Chinese men all worked in laundry. So they start entering these effeminized positions, and they're exempt from nuclear families, and they can't be a citizenship. They can't be citizens. They can't build monetary capital or own land. And so all these things that really qualify one as being masculine in American society, Asian men have no access to. And this was until the 50s. So it's super recent. Yeah. And just these ideas and these stereotypes, they just got carried out super fully into where we are now.
And I think it's crazy because like when we think about the Asian American male in representation, especially within mass media, we don't see it a lot, right? You don't see, the sexualization. You see Black males over sexualized. You see Asian women over sexualized, but you really don't see that with Asian men. And to your point, with walking into the gym and seeing predominantly Asian males trying to work on their physique and stuff like that. I think it kind of all plays into that stereotype and that mindset of Asian men, not being sexualized and demasculating, Asian men. And I think like somebody have mentioned this in a previous episode, but like, on Tinder and these social dating apps, like Black women and Asian men are like the least swiped upon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It's like that dynamic, that historical context that you just gave us is really interesting that it still plays out now. Right. Because even I spent a little bit of time in the military, and I remember seeing individuals with wives from Korea, because I believe there's a base in South Korea. These white men would bring Asian women back to America and they didn't even speak English. And I'm just like, what is that dynamic? And then like looking at commercials, looking at, mass media and seeing like the white male as a focal point in interracial, connections, whether it's with the light-skinned Black woman or an Asian woman, in commercials, it's just like they continue to like subtly perpetuate that idea of, over-sexualizing Asian women and not, allowing Asian men to have the proper representation. So it's kind of cool to hear the historical context and how that continues to perpetuate itself in present day. And like even you mentioned Asian men in K-pop and how that kind of gave you the confidence and I guess swag in a way. Can you kind of speak to that? Like, what was that experience like? You finding your own footing and just confidence?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at the way that Asian men have tried to really kind of regain some notions of masculinity. Looking at me personally, yeah, the reason K-pop helped so much was, I guess, honestly, it feels kind of messed up to say now, but it was the first time that I guess you could say I'd seen Asian men sexualized. It was kind of a beauty standard that reflected me a lot more than Chris Hemsworth does, like The Rock. And so when I saw it and I saw these things, they were kind of what I wanted for myself already, right? It kind of looked like more leeway in terms of exploring what it meant to be feminine. And it was a way to connect to my culture or, my ethnic culture, my cultural heritage. And so it was kind of just really easy, a really easy way for me to navigate it. It was just honestly like, it was convenient. Like when I look back on it, it just made the most sense because I wanted to feel more Korean. But kind of to your point with Asian men and Black women, yeah, when you look at that relationship, it's because Asian men and African American men are like on opposite ends of the masculine spectrum. Like you have this Black man who's hypersexualized and this Asian man is emasculated. And this is a pretty new thought for me. But when I look at a lot of the Asian American people around me, I think because of that, that difference between people. I've seen a lot of them turning to appropriating, or maybe not appropriating, but incorporating a lot of traditionally African American culture into their stuff, into who they are. You know, using Ave for the music they listen to, or the way they dress, or just even the people that they're interested in, or even the way that they try to like bodybuild. A lot of it, because this is my own idea, but when you have these, or sports, especially like basketball,
Mhm.
but when you have these characteristics that have been so typically associated with hypermasculinity, it only
Mhm.
makes sense that someone who wants to gain more masculinity really leans into that. You know, some people might call it, you know, I want to be more cool, but it all comes back to masculinity, in my own opinion.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so it's been really interesting.
Yeah, I think I've seen a TikTok about that. I wish I could pull it up, but it was a TikTok that kind of leans into your point to where like, you know, Asian men have been so I guess drug in society in regards to masculinity that they look at black men and they appropriate black culture in some ways to kind of make up for that gap. So
Yeah.
I think that's a valid point. It's a valid point. Um
So I lead a club at OSU. It's called People of Color in Business. So it
mhm,
focuses on supporting the identities of students of color learning within the College of Business in ways that the institution fails to or neglects to provide.
mhm.
But I had this conversation, I guess it was a few weeks ago, with the Asia Pacific American Student Union Club, massive club, like 120 people, a meeting. We
Jeez.
kind of talked about, yeah, it's really cool. That kind of fifth gen, sixth gen experience or cultural isolation, you know, when you feel alienated from your one community, you know, all these people feel isolated from their cultural heritage. That's also something that forms a new community, because in that shared isolation, you have that collective experience. So when I look at people of color in business and the club that I'm trying to make, or helping to make, and the space we create, it really has been a big matter, kind of putting these positive aspects and these positive notions back into being a person of color. Like, look at these communities that are possible, and look at the richness and cultural diversity that you can bring in, and these shared common experiences, the power that's built, and this intellectual capacity. And look what you can do with all of that. And it's also been really important in avoiding that compassion fatigue, right? Like, God,
Yeah.
like, why should I even be a person of color? Like, this is so exhausting. Like, I'm so tired. I wish I could check out. Like, why would you want to check out, right? Look at everything it
Yeah.
brings.
But speaking to like sometimes, you know, doing the POC, being Mr. POC and doing the brand in which I operate for trying to provide, you know, a product and experience for people of color. It gets exhaustive sometimes. So I will say sometimes I do want to check out, but those moments are like few and far between. Because it is exhaustive, right? It is exhaustive, especially dealing with like from a business standpoint, having to learn marketing, and you know it's just like marketing these days is just ever evolving, and it's just like you got to have TikTok, you got to do this, you got to, so it's just like I think that part of it gets exhaustive, but my passion for community, my passion for you know, creating impact never really subsides. It's never daunting, because I know like I know the history, right? I know that, you know, where we come from, and I know we still have a long way to go. So it's inspiring seeing people like you and hearing your story and hearing your passion and your fervor for the things you kind of want to talk about, and the people that you want to represent. It just kind of it energizes me as a business owner, just to keep going, right? So to have you in a
Definitely.
position, a leadership position, is really dope. It's really cool to see that, you know, you're having an impact in a real way, and you're creating community. I'm all about community. Community is something that's really big for me and the brand and the impact that I want to have. So it's really cool to see you doing the work that you're doing with the POC business club at OSU.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's super exhausting for sure. I mean, it's like I say all the time, like it's like I feel like that club is giving me like my highest highs and like the lowest lows.
Yeah, for sure.
But
I know.
at the end of the yeah, at the end of the day, it's like something that I kind of remind myself. Is like, I mean, there's not really a choice, right? Like, I mean, yeah, like you could check out to an extent, and then being, you know, half white and Asian and like economically privileged, I can check out to a much higher extent than other people. Like at the end of the day, like I'm better for the people around me, I'm better for the people after me, and I'm better for myself, because we deserve better, right? We're entitled to it. So it's like even at those moments, it's like, you know, like we got to get there one way or another.
But even speaking to that, you know both sides, right? You know privilege, and you're learning about your identity in a way that you can empathize, right? You can create community. You can speak, you know, from a metaphoric standpoint, you can speak two different language, right? You can speak privilege talk. You can speak coming from money, and you can also speak culture, right? So, and I think combining those two things puts you in a unique position to then impute, I guess, education and the different perspectives amongst people who might not have that experience. So I think it's a really cool position to be in, you know, having seen both sides, right? You've seen success, you know what success looks like, you know what money management looks like. And now you're dealing with individuals who are seeking that knowledge, and you've seen it, right? So I think it's cool.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. You know, I never really thought about it like that. I know the little headline down there says imposter syndrome. I would say for me, you know, being in this position of leadership as someone who is, you know, from an economically privileged background and being, you know, in such close proximity to white privilege, there's been a pretty heavy level of, I guess you could call it imposter syndrome, but also guilt and feeling like, you know, am I entitled to this position of leadership? Because when I think about this people of color space, and I think about the space I'm creating, you know, I obviously have I have anti-Blackness within me and these ideologies. And I don't understand a lot of these perspectives from people from different economic backgrounds, or people who are immigrants. And so obviously, you know, like one person can't create that space. You got to bring other people in around you. But it's definitely been a feeling of guilt and feeling like, you know, what entitles me to this position? Like, I mean, at the end of the day with social justice, if you want to do the work, like there's so much work to do, like everybody can put their work in, that's very invited. But sometimes the thing that really does motivate me for better or for worse is that feeling of guilt, right? If I'm the person who's privileged enough to be in this position, like I better make the most out of it. And so it's training sometimes, but at the same time, like, you know, it keeps you moving. But it's been interesting for sure.
So kind of learning a little bit about your mother and her experience, can you kind of talk about your dad and that relationship and that dynamic with that side of the family, and kind of how that plays into like your biracial identity?
Yeah. So just to give some background, my dad, he's from the East Coast, small town in Massachusetts. His dad's from like, I think Iowa, like a farming town in Iowa. His mom's born and raised. So a pretty traditional white family for sure. Not super economically privileged, like middle lower class, up until my dad, who's a lawyer. But yeah, it's been really interesting, and it's kind of what's bred this idea in my head that I feel like when white parents are going to be the parents of children of color, like they should do some research for sure. Like I feel like, yeah, you know, having a white dad, there's been a lot of points of conflict, points of tension. I think first and foremost, even in terms of like my own ideologies, like I think it's a pretty common process for people of color kind of starting to see more things in racialized terms, but like I do hold anti-white sentiment like within me. Like it's undeniable. Obviously it's not towards white individuals, it's more of the systems that they created in capitalism.
Yeah.
But it's undeniable that that does extend itself to my dad a little bit. And you know, just in like my own experiences with him, like of course there are microaggressions that exist there. You know, comments here, comments there, like always wanting us to go talk to Asian families when we're anywhere. I get it. Like, that's really cool. Like, I appreciate, like, I would feel more comfortable talking to them, but it also sets this notion of like alienation. So yeah, you know, I think just that aspect has been interesting, but even more interesting has been the intersection of masculinity in it, and my kind of Asian masculinity and his hegemonic white masculinity. Because, you know, I don't know where we're going to put this, but I've definitely talked today about how for me, I've really embraced more of the femininity that exists within me in terms of, you know, style and expression and my interests, and even the way I interact with other people. And my dad is very traditionally masculine. So when I did start embracing, you know, my Korean background and feeling more masculine through navigating that stuff, I felt insane pushback from him for it. You know, I mean, I wear like a bunch of pearls on my neck, like my ears are super pierced. I obviously like my jewelry, and that's just not what he was into. So it was kind of this split of, I was trying to navigate my Asian masculinity and what that looked like for me and explore my own realm of masculinity. And then he had this idea of what it meant to be a man. And there was like this big conflict. It definitely still exists. Yeah. but it's just almost been like, like my two cultural turmoils existing within me. And I've navigated it pretty well, I'd like to think. And there's not a single story for what kind of masculinity looks like for each cultural background.
Yeah, for
But
sure. Especially when you're
difficult.
navigating two that are grossly different, right? So it sounds like you've kind of created your own lane in regards to just being who you are. Like Geoffrey is Geoffrey, and
Yeah.
Geoffrey is going to be Geoffrey. And I think it's cool how you've kind of combined, in a way, your Asian heritage and the K-pop culture, and you've really embraced that, and you've really like kind of ran with that. So I can see how his American white, privileged masculine, perspective can kind of clash with you kind of finding your own footing in your own masculinity and femininity too as well. So I think that's dope. I think it's dope how you've been able to kind of etch out your own you-ness.
Yeah. Obviously, I just want to preface that if you're listening, I love you. I just want to, clear the air, but yeah, kind of like what you said. And I think like if I could give a piece of advice for people, kind of like, me 5 years ago, I guess you could say, navigating this stuff, and kind of what you touched on, it's like when you look at how to navigate this stuff, like it's not a matter of you forcing yourself to any mold, because it's just not how it is. It's a matter of seeing how all these collective things around you have influenced you. Like even ethnically, I identify more as Asian American than Korean American. Have you heard like the terminology like an ethnic boundary?
I have not, no.
Yeah, so kind of like when you determine ethnicity, an ethnic boundary says that, if you're from this one culture, it's been so impactful on you that you would feel out of place in any other culture because of it. So, right, if someone's from Korea and they go to, France, they're probably going to be and live in France for 10 years, like Korean American or Korean French. So for me, when I look at my own ethnicity, I identify as Asian American because I might be genetically Korean, but when I really get down to it, I'm not really that Korean, right? I've experienced a large range of cultures, and I've kind of pulled from that in a way that feels best to me, not in an appropriation way, of course. But so yeah, just in any regard, in any intersection, like when you try to figure out your place in everything, it's not about like your place in that, it's all of that's place in you, if that makes sense. How that's led to your own, like your own being, and kind of navigating that in the way that makes sense for you. Like don't force a mold because you won't fit it.
Yeah, for sure. And a question that I like to close out with, that I try to remember to ask every guest is, always, for people who listen, they kind of hear this all the time, but I always describe it as going back into this time machine, right? If you can go into a time machine and talk to your younger self, being the person that you are today, what are some of the things that you would go back in time and tell your younger self, and prepare your younger self for?
Man, I would probably say I'd want to go back to kind of the start of my, self-perceived racialization, and kind of say, give yourself space to process this anger. You're fully valid in feeling it, but make sure you understand like what's your end goal, what are you working towards, and what should you probably work on navigating so you don't actually end up perpetuating the things you're trying to take down. Because this anger that I have, like it's really not community help. It's not healing, right? It's going to keep people separate at the end of the day. So kind of going back to that, maybe better navigating it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like even when me starting POC, I was so focused on this like forest bias mentality, us versus them mentality, that I think it really took away from my message. And I think like, that loving component, having that community aspect. And I know you kind of talked about community a lot, when you were talking about the club. I think creating a community of like-minded people that are passionate about equity, that are passionate about change, is how we move forward, right? So, having this collective group of people from different backgrounds, right? From being biracial, being adopted, being multiracial, being, what we perceive as Black, Asian, Asian American, first gen, sixth gen, like we all have something to bring to the table. And it takes a collective effort to really bring about change. So,
Definitely.
I think, all in all, I think you killed this episode. This episode was really dope. You talked on a lot of things. You brought a lot of historical context to things that, of course, me, being in the world that I live in, and, mass media hearing about the, the mass migration, hearing about the double eyelid surgery, like for you to kind of bring context and the historical perspective to that, and kind of whip it around to present day, how that's still perpetuated. That was extremely dope. Like, I got to commend you for just being well versed and I don't know, sharing your story with the platform. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed this interview.
Yeah, it was cool. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's cool too because like I've been so drained from like the club stuff, but I haven't even done like a ton of education. But like as soon as I was like, yeah, like we're doing this, I was like, oh shit, like I got to go read a little bit more. And it kind of like reignites that passion to kind of like educate. You know, it really makes it more. I feel like doing this work, like it's really important to understand like the impact you're having like around you and feeling energized. Yeah, and letting the people around you help energize you. Like it's not you versus everyone.
Yeah, like, for sure. And I think that I don't know, with this podcast platform, again, I just wanted to I used to spend so much time trying to find like, oh, let me try to find a person with a blue check, or let me try to find this person that yada yada yada. When I just kind of broke it down and I humbled myself, and I'm just like, damn, I got almost 12,000 people that are following my brand who they got some shit to say themselves. And that's going to wrap up this week's episode. I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to tap in with the Colour Reimagined Podcast, presented to you by People of Color Clothing. And a special shout out to Geoffrey for sharing his time, his energy, his essence, and his knowledge with us. It was a very enlightening episode for me personally. I don't know about you, but for me, I feel like I'm walking away from this interview experience enlightened. And I have some new information to research, some new information in my tool belt. So, and that's what our platform is about. It's all about capturing community voices, giving people the platform to share their story, share their voice, share their experience. And that's what this platform has become, and that's what this platform is going to be. So, again, thank you for listening to the Colour Reimagined Podcast. And again, if you want to be a part of the podcast experience, all you got to do is hit us up via email, via DM, whatever. Hit me up. Tell me when, tell me where, tell me what you want to talk about, and it's done. Again, thank you for listening to the Colour Reimagined Podcast, presented to you by People of Color Clothing. And until next time, take care.